Well, welcome everybody to Mr. Murray's very first online fact. Before we can start it though, we've got something even more important to do, and that is good things. Now, don't worry, you've already had to sit through three of my good things, so this time I thought I'd share them from other people. All day long, kids have been sharing the good things going on with them, and, well, I thought I'd share them with the rest of you. One word of warning, I am not allowed to use your full names here, so if you shared something with me, be on the lookout for your initials. Let's see. HD saw the movies Shazam and Peanut Butter Falcon. RR had a sleepover. NK did gardening, planting strawberries, hot peppers, onions, cabbage, corn, sunflowers, tomatoes, and carrots, plus set up a hummingbird feeder. LC rode bikes with the family at the Georgetown Dam. GP went to Hawaii, saw whales and turtles, went fishing, and hung out by the pool. I'm going to assume that was before the quarantine stuff went into effect, but I'm very glad you had that experience. JM finished a book series. CW went to the Guadalupe Mountains and Carlsbad Caverns. EC has been playing Connect Sports and totally dominating. SW gets to have cousins stay with the family for a while. All right, back to your regularly scheduled fact of the day. The date is March 24th, 1603, and the power of math tells me that is exactly 417 years ago this very day. The star of our fact is this fine, handsome looking gentleman right there, sitting on a very comfortable looking pillow cushion type thing. The fact is, Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun of Japan, ending the Sengoku Jidai. I am going to go out on a limb and say that sentence probably had about 5 words you're not familiar with. So let's take a look. We've got Tokugawa Ieyasu. Well, that's easy. That is simply this dude's name. Yay, it's a name. We're moving on. Shogun. This is a Japanese word that in English we usually translate it as warlord. The shogun was in charge of all of the armies and all of the soldiers in Japan. But actually, they were in charge of everything. See, when you're in charge of all of the soldiers and all of the short, stabby, pointy things, it can become really easy to just be in charge of everything because who's going to tell you no? You may be aware that both today and back then, Japan has and had an emperor. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at him. Back then, the emperor was the Emperor Goyose, this guy right here. But see, both in the modern day and back then, the emperor in Japan has what's basically a ceremonial role. We talked about stuff like this. You know, the emperor is more a throw out the first baseball pitch of the season kind of leader, whereas somebody else is actually in charge. And back then, that somebody was the shogun, the warlord of all Japan. That still leaves us with 2 words we haven't talked about, though. Sengoku Jidai. To answer the question, what is the Sengoku Jidai? I'm going to ask you a question that, man, I really hope you guys know the answer to. What was the most deadly war for America? In other words, what war did America fight in that caused the most American deaths? Think about it. I really hope you knew that was the Civil War, starting in 1861 and going until 1865. The American Civil War was 4 very long years of America tearing itself apart. Many more Americans died in this war than any of the other wars we fought. It's not even really very close. And the Sengoku Jidai is Japan's Civil War. Except, look at these dates underneath the name. The C right here means circa or around. So the Sengoku Jidai, Japan's Civil War, started somewhere around 1467 and didn't end until somewhere around 1603. That according to the power of math, is 136 years. Think about that for a second. That means it would take 34 of our civil wars to equal the length of time that just one of Japan's civil wars lasted. That is crazy. And the Sengoku Jidai, it was every bit as horrible as living through our civil war. Japan truly was tearing itself apart. And think about it. That means you could have fought in this war, then seen your children grow up to fight in it, then your grandchildren, then your great grandchildren. And I'm going to stop there because I'm getting depressed, but I could probably keep going for a little bit. To understand the Sengoku Jidai, let's look at a timeline. We will start at the beginning. 1467. It broke out as something called the Onin War. To understand why it broke out, we need to see our cast of characters. First up, we have the Shogun. Now, this is the warlord, the guy in charge of all of Japan, and he was doing pretty well except for one major problem, and that was he had no son, no heir to pass on the shogunate once he died, and you need somebody to follow you. Japan needs a shogun to be in charge. So he went to his brother. His brother was actually serving as a monk, spending most of his time in prayer. And the shogun went to his brother and said, "Please, please, once I die, won't you take over? Won't you be shogun?" And his brother thought about it and agreed. He stopped being a monk and he instead became the heir. Everybody in Japan acknowledged him as the heir, and all right, things look like they're on a decent path. But then something nobody was expecting happened. The shogun was kind of old at this point, and out of nowhere, he ended up having a son after all. In most cases, it would be the son that would become the new shogun. But a whole bunch of Japan had already agreed that they would have his brother as the next shogun. So what ended up happening is half of Japan lined up behind the brother, the other half of Japan supported the son, and civil war happened. More war and a lot more war. We're now in the 1470s and the war is still going. But that's not enough. That's just one civil war. How about by the 1480s, we have another one piled on top, something called the Kaga Rebellion happening in the province of Kaga, where peasants rose up against and began fighting the samurai. Give it another 10 years, and you actually have a new guy to sit on the pillows, a new shogun of Japan. This shogun was from a family called the Hosokawa family, and they have one very important flaw. That is, they were really bad at agreeing which member of their family should be the next shogun. So, by the 1500s, you've got war number three, the Hosokawa family fighting over who should be the next shogun. Oh, by the 1510s, you've got the Ryo Hosokawa War, where, once again, the Hosokawa family is fighting over which member gets to be shogun. By the 1520s, China is pretty much done with Japan, and well, let's look at Japan right here. Japan, as you may be aware, is a series of islands. If you are in Japan and you want something that's not from Japan, you're going to need a boat to bring it to you. And back then, pretty much all those boats came from China, which was over to the west. But after 50 years of civil war, China was fed up. When they would send trade ships to Japan, half the time they would be intercepted by pirates that no one had time to get rid of because they were busy civil warring. Or even when they did land, sometimes the local people who were fighting it out would just rush the ships and steal everything on board. So, at this point, China's done with Japan. And they're like, all right, Japan, here's the deal. We are sending you no more boats, no more stuff. And If you send boats over to us, we will set them on fire and sink them to the bottom of the ocean. So, whenever you're done with your civil war, maybe give us a call. Until then, now, do you think that made everybody in Japan arguing and fighting and dying and killing over who got to be shogun? Do you think that made them take a pause, take stock, and maybe come to a more peaceful solution? No, no. Did you really think the Hosokawa were done? They are still busy fighting and killing each other over who got to rule Japan next. But then, in the 1540s, we have a game changer. The Portuguese show up. These are the first Westerners to ever make it to Japan. And when they showed up, they brought two very important things: Christianity and guns. Now, the story of Christianity in Japan is actually a really interesting one. Jesuit missionaries swarmed over Japan and actually managed to convert a lot of the country to Christianity. Then later, Christianity was declared illegal, and everyone who had decided to be Christian was forced to renounce it. If you were one of those Japanese Christians and you declined, you could face penalties up to and including crucifixion, which is how people in Japan executed criminals. What that led to is a lot of Christians in Japan became what's called kakure kirishitan, which means hidden Christians. For the next couple hundred years, they would hide the fact that they were still following the Christian religion until a few hundred years later when it finally became legal again. But more relevant for our fact of the day today is guns. If you know much about the samurai warriors in Japan, one of the first things you probably think of is their swords. And fair enough, because if you don't think that samurai masters were some of the greatest swordsmen ever to walk this earth, then you are very much mistaken, sir. On the other hand, if you think the samurai didn't immediately realize that these gun things could take their civil war to a whole nother level, you are equally mistaken. The samurai quickly adopted guns. They actually looked at the Portuguese versions and invented their own called the Tanegashima. The and that basically became another tool in their arsenal for making the Civil War that much worse and that much more deadly. In the 1550s, we see a big team up of three families called the Takeda, the Hojo, and the Imagawa. But that still wasn't enough to bring the Civil War to an end. By the 1560s, though, we're just getting ready to see the beginning of the end. Only the beginning. We're going to keep going for many decades, but it's time to talk about the unifiers, the people who would finally bring Japan back together. And any discussion of the unifiers has to start with this guy, Oda Nobunaga. He is famous throughout Japan and a lot of the rest of the world for his drive, his determination to be the one who reunited Japan and to be shogun, and his utter ruthlessness in pursuing that goal. To take one example, let's talk about these guys. These are the Ikoiki. They are warrior monks. They are martial arts masters and highly skilled with guns to boot. They had a practically impenetrable fortress in which sat 10,000 of them. And in that fortress, they had it piled high with enough food and water and supplies to hold out for a decade. And they defied Oda Nobunaga. So, Oda Nobunaga sent his army to surround that fortress, and they kept it surrounded for the next 10 years. When the 10,000 people inside were finally beginning to run low on supplies, then his men set the entire mountainside on fire. And as the fortress was blazing with flames, The few people who had survived the hunger and the fire saw his army marching towards them, and they soon learned what it meant to defy Oda Nobunaga. If you need another example of just how determined this guy was, well, this seems like a good time to talk about ninja. Because, yeah, hey, you guys have heard of ninja, and the Sengoku Jidai was one of the periods when the ninja got to really run around and do their ninja thing. There was a ninja sniper named Sugatani Zenjubo. He had been hired to kill Oda Nobunaga. He was an expert with guns, and he had brought along his favorite gun plus a backup gun. He stalked Nobunaga, and then he saw his shot. He took it, firing his best gun. He hit Nobunaga, but that wasn't enough. He tossed that gun to the side, pulled out his backup gun, and fired that one too. Another hit. Then he ran off before anybody could catch him. But Nobunaga wasn't going to let a thing like being shot twice by a literal ninja sniper stop him. He survived, and he sent some of his soldiers on a 4-year quest to hunt down the man who had dared to shoot him. And after 4 years, when they caught him, well, I would not have liked to have been Sugatami Zenjubo at that moment. All right. After several decades of fighting, Nobunaga had actually managed to unify most of Japan. There was only a little bit of resistance left. Basically, the final cleanup, nothing hard. So, he decided it was time for him to take a vacation. And he would start his vacation by going off and praying a bit at a temple called Honoji. There was a nearby battle that needed to be fought. An easy, easy one, just part of the cleanup. And he sent one of his generals, a guy named Akechi Mitsuhide, to go take care of the easy battle, while he had his vacation. In one of history's great mysteries, for reasons we still don't know, his general, Mitsuhide, instead of marching off to go fight the easy battle, instead marched the army towards the temple where Nobunaga was starting his vacation. He pointed at the temple and he screamed, "The enemy is in there." The soldiers charged in, kind of confused and not really knowing what was going on, tearing the place apart, setting it on fire, and killing anyone inside. And so, Oda Nobunaga would not survive to be shogun of Japan. But Mitsuhide was not his only general. He had several others, including Toyotomi Hideyoshi. This guy actually this as soon as he heard what had happened to Nobunaga, he quickly gathered his part of the army, marched directly towards Mitsuhide, and, well, quite frankly, Hideyoshi was a much better general and quickly knocked Mitsuhide out of the picture. Let's talk about Hideyoshi for just a second, because he has a really interesting background. He started his career in Nobunaga's army as, and I am not joking, Nobunaga's official sandal carrier. That's right, his job was to carry his boss's shoes. But he must have been a pretty epic sandal carrier, because he was continually ranked up in the army again and again and again. Although, besides just carrying sandals, he might have done some really cool stuff, like this picture of him leading a small group of men on a climb up the side of the mountain to sneak into a protected fortress on the top of the mountain and open the gates for everybody else. But, So, with Nobunaga dead and Mitsuhide dead, Hideyoshi was now in charge of all of Nobunaga's armies. And you know what? You know that cleanup that Nobunaga never got to do? Hideyoshi did it. He smashed out all of the resistance that was left in Japan. He was in charge, but they would not declare him shogun. See, he was a peasant. He was of low birth. That's, why he started out carrying sandals. And because of that, most of the other noble houses were not willing to recognize him as shogun, even though he definitely was the boss. And eventually, he got sick. and he died. Now, before he died, he had made everybody promise that they would support his son and let his son be in charge after him. Little problem, though. At the time, his son was about 4 or 5 years old. And even though all the other generals had crossed their heart, pinky promised that they would support his son, yeah, that didn't happen. Japan went right back to civil warring, which brings us right back to the person we started with, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He had been one of Nobunaga's supporters. Then he had been one of Hideyoshi's supporters. And now that Japan was plunged back into civil war, he quickly emerged as the leader of about half of Japan. His half and the other half would meet together in bloody battle. But first, let's talk a little bit about this guy, because I've only mentioned ninja once, and the most famous real life ninja of all time, a guy named Hattori Hanzo, worked for Tokugawa Ieyasu. Actually, at one point, Tokugawa was completely surrounded by his enemies, no escape, and he called in his ninja friend, Hattori Hanzo, who used a whole bunch of ninja moves to basically destroy the enemy's camp, and then took Tokugawa Ieyasu out of the danger area by moving through an area of Japan that was completely controlled by ninja. Anyway, Tokugawa controlled half of Japan. His enemies controlled the other half. And they met at a battle called Sekigahara. The battle was long and it was bloody, but in the end, Tokugawa Ieyasu rose supreme. And unlike Hideyoshi, he was from a noble family, and so had himself declared shogun, warlord of all Japan. But the Civil War doesn't end just because somebody says they're shogun. What about what happens when they die? Isn't there going to be, we going to fall right back into civil war with everybody fighting over who gets to go next? Well, Tokugawa Ieyasu had a really clever plan. See, he only stayed shogun officially for a couple of years. After he had been shogun for a little while, he retired and appointed his son as the new shogun. But he kept pretty much all the power for himself. Officially, he was done. He was retired. Everybody had to go to his son and go, "Oh, wise shogun, what should we be doing?" While really Tokugawa Ieyasu kept all the power for himself. And this continued for many years. See, and the thing is, because he never really handed off power, there wasn't really the opportunity to have a big fight over who was in charge. It was still him. Then, after many years, when he finally did die, it didn't seem like that big a change because his son just went from being pretend shogun to being real shogun. People had spent years and years being, "Oh, wise shogun, what should we do?" Even though they knew his dad was in charge. And now that his dad was gone, everybody was used to going to him and calling him the shogun. And so his son managed to take over without descending back into civil war. Their family would continue to control Japan for a very long time after that. There we go. We made it to the end. Couple of announcements before I close out. First of all, I hope you found this interesting. If you did, I highly recommend checking out a channel called Extra History. They did an amazing series on the Sengoku Jidai and talked about all sorts of stuff I didn't have time to, like cool stuff, people diving off the walls of castles. Like, seriously, check it out. I'll put a link in the description below. Second, if you have not yet completed the South Asia form that I put in Google Classroom, it would be amazing if you could finish that by Thursday. That'll give me time to, you know, research the questions you guys are asking so that I can give you good, valid, correct answers to all the questions. Other than that, I will finish off by saying, I hope you guys are all doing well. Please stay safe and please stay healthy.